A Lion Locomotive in 5-inch gauge, part 9, looking at the plumbing on this engine and making the front wheel set look right. This valve on the footplate is the water pump bypass valve, and when I open it, not unsurprisingly, water comes out of the pipe. And a silicone rubber hose from this piece of pipe on the engine to a similar piece of pipe on the tender allows the water that's pumped by the axle pump to go back into the tender instead of going into the boiler. Once you close this valve, it feeds the boiler. And depending how near shut or open this valve is, depends how much water goes back into the tender and how much goes into the boiler. That's the principle. The problem is, when I do not have any water going to the pump and I open this valve, water still comes out of the pipe. Where's it getting the water from? From the boiler via one of the check valves, which is halfway down the boiler barrel. This check valve on the back head is the one from the hand pump that's fitted in the tender. I think I'll change this because it looks horrible. But it does actually work, I tested it, and it doesn't leak. But this is not the case with the check valve on the right hand side of the boiler, which is supposed to handle the boiler feed from the axle driven pump. The problem is that these two check valves on each side of the boiler barrel are dummies. All they are really are 90-degree elbows just to allow the water into the boiler. The real check valves are underneath and one of them isn't working. I'm turning the engine on its side and carefully resting it on quite a lot of corrugated cardboard. And this is a view from underneath. The firebox of the boiler sits in a brass framework, which is quite neat really. This is an LBSC design and it has two superheater flues with superheaters in there. Here's the first part of the plumbing. This is the water inlet that feeds the pump. This is okay and it's very easy to get at. The rest of the plumbing is not. This is the crankshaft driven pump. Not wishing to split hairs, it's really a crosshead pump. I refer to it as an axle driven pump because the principle is the same. When the engine is rolling down the track, water is pumped into the boiler or back to the tender in varying amounts depending on the setting of the valve on the footplate. The pump itself would be difficult enough to remove, but the plumbing for it is really inaccessible. With a lot of effort and a couple of small spanners, I could undo all the unions and remove the valves. But I think I'll do that when I remove the centre crank axle to repair it. As you can clearly see in this clip, there's quite a lot of movement on it because it's loose. When I first looked at this engine I thought, oh no, the crank webs are held in place using grub screws, but they're not, they're roll pins. As you can clearly see, the small Allen key goes all the way through the roll pins. Roll pins are hardened spring steel tubes, usually slit down one side so they can be tapped into position and stay where they're put. I'm going to replace these with taper pins, but in order to do that I need to remove the crank axle, fit it between centres in the lathe to make sure it's true, and ream the holes tapered. I will also be using some Loctite 603 to hold the entire assembly solid. By carrying out the job in the lathe, the crank axle should end up being accurate. As you can clearly see, with the engine on its side, water is dripping out of the water inlet to the pump. My bench is very wet and I'm getting sick of this, so here I'm catching the water in a receptacle via some silicone rubber tubing. These dummy check valves on the boiler really do look the part, but I need to find a much better arrangement to fit proper check valves underneath the boiler and ones that work. Time now to look at this problem. I don't mean the problem where the crank webs were bored too big for the axle and have been sleeved. This is the rear axle, which has drilled centres at each side. I'm more concerned about the front axles, which don't have any centres and besides they're a bit short. I do have a fix for this though, and it's a simple one. First of all, I need to clean out the recess thoroughly. I'm using my scriber, I used a piece of steel, I used a piece of emery cloth and even an ordinary cotton cloth, and eventually it was a lot cleaner. Now I need to measure the diameter of the crank web. As you can see, I'm using a digital caliper to do this. I put this piece of steel, which had already been turned at some time, in the 3-jaw chuck, and in this clip I'm facing across the front of it. First a rough cut, then a fine cut. As you can clearly see, the piece is very much out of true, but it really doesn't matter because the piece I turn from this piece of stock will be accurate. The next part of the job involves using a centre drill in the tailstock to drill a centre hole in the end of the piece of bar. I didn't centre it too deeply, I made it look like the one on the front axle. Now it's time to turn down the outside diameter to exactly the same diameter as the crank web. And I thought while I was at it I would show you this. Look at the finish on the work, it's diabolical. What's going on here? Well, the tool tip is damaged, to be honest. It was damaged to start with. So I changed it for a new tip and look at the difference. The finish is a lot better. I don't need to go all the way down because I just need 2 little buttons cutting off the piece of steel. So here I'm parting off button number 1. I'm not going to show the making of the second button, as it was made in exactly the same way as you've just seen, same thickness, same diameter, same everything. That's one down in the chip tray. All I have to do now is fit this button into the recess where the axle fits into the crank web, and Loctite 603 retainer should hold this in place. I applied Loctite 603 to both the axle and to the button itself. All I need to do now is tap it into position, using the words gently and with a soft hammer. I was quite pleased with the result. This looks dead right. Just a quick clean with a cloth to shine everything up. By this stage, because of the bad plumbing underneath the engine, with it being on its side, most of the water from the boiler was running onto the bench. It was time to open the blowdown valve and drain the boiler. I've turned the engine around and I'm now doing the other side, starting with cleaning the recess, first with my scriber, followed by emery cloth, followed by Scotch-Brite, followed by a cloth with some solvent on it. And I think that's more than clean enough. In this clip I'm cleaning up the inner surface of the button using some emery cloth. And as before, I'm now applying some Loctite 603 to the recess, then removing some of it because as usual I used too much. This button is exactly the same shape and size as the one at the other side, but when I tap it into place, it's sticking out too far. It actually looks better sticking out like this, but the other one doesn't. That's almost flush with the crank pin. This is a small gas blowtorch that I use, and recently when I was soldering with it, it started to leak, and small gas explosions were coming from around this area, the valve. And the good news, which coincidentally is relative to this episode, I've bought a better one, a much better one. I'll use the smaller blowtorch just for lighting gas burners. This Proxxon blowtorch is a much better tool altogether. Not only can you vary the gas pressure, you can vary the amount of air that the flame gets, so you can get it from a pinpoint to a broader flame, even to a sooty flame, which personally I don't have a use for because I use marking out fluid. The small blowtorch comes with a nice little base, which allows it to sit on the bench upright. There's no real need to remove this, it can stay on the blowtorch. I will use this blowtorch for heating up the button that I've just fitted to the axle, so I can remove it and make a thinner one. It will be ideal for the job. That's it for this episode. Stay well, thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back, making it unnecessary to comment that the videos are too short.